Oh na 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 na. Bam bam. Oh na 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 na. Bam bam. Oh na 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 na. Bam bam. Oh na 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 na. Big it up. Oh na 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 na. Big it up. Oh na 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 na. Bam bam. Bir bam bam bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam. Bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam bir bam bam bir bam bir de. Bir bam bam. Bir bam bir bam 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 bam. Bir bam bir de.
Welcome to Home and Away Jamaica, where we bring and connect Jamaica with the diaspora. It's good to be here again. Robert Taylor, attorney at law, your host. And I'm very pleased again to have with us Miss STACY SALMON. STACY is managing partner at Taylor Law. And as usual, STACY will join us to answer some very specific questions, some questions thrown out by our viewers on property matters. STACY, welcome. Happy to have you.
All right. Thanks, Robert. Thanks again for having me.
Great. So, STACY, I'm just going to go through some questions that our viewers have posted and ask you to address them. So, the first question, one viewer spoke to the program we came on registered land and squatters. We in our parlance, we say adverse possession. But they wanted to know, how do you address formalizing possession for squatters with unregistered land?
Okay. All right. So the process and the documents required are similar to what is involved in adverse possession for registered land. So you would need the surveyor's identification report, you would need the valuation report, you'd have to show evidence that the property taxes have been paid up to date, and set out your claim for ownership. The only difference is that because the property is unregistered, you would have to prove or establish who the legal owner is. Because there is no title to state who the legal owner is, you would have to prove ownership, the legal owner. If you're unable to identify and prove who the legal owner is, you'd have to show that you've been in possession and occupation for 30 years, as opposed to 12 years possession.
Okay, so very important point. What I understand that you're saying, STACY, is that the legal concept of adverse possession requires that the person seeking possession by adverse means is displacing a legal title holder. And so if it is that it's unregistered land, you have to show that you're displacing someone who actually has an interest in that land, or who has claimed an interest in that land, although it may not be by a registered title. If you're unable to do so, then you must show the statutory period is 30 years for you to show that you've been in possession.
Right, that's correct.
And so there could be some risk for someone trying to displace actual owner in possession, though not on title, because once that person has notice of someone taking possession of their land, they may intervene to displace that claim of possession.
Right.
Okay. So our viewers need to be aware of this. So unlike your registered title, your claim of possession is not 12 years, it's 30 years.
Right, but if they can establish who the legal owner is, the 12-year period will be accepted.
Okay.
If you're unable to show who the legal owner is of the unregistered land, you have to show 30 years possession.
30 years of uninterrupted possession.
Right.
You mentioned property taxes, STACY. A question came in, and I'll follow on with this, on land valuation and property taxes. And I think what we can do perhaps is get someone from the land valuation department, as this isn't quite in our remit, but perhaps we can speak on property taxes.
Sure. All right, so in your application for first registration or adverse possession, one of the requirements is that the property taxes on the premises must be up to date. So as I said, that's just one factor. So the fact that you've paid up the property taxes alone will not be sufficient for you to claim ownership. This is just one of many other things that you have to show.
So property taxes in of itself, because we get many questions like this in our practice. Persons say they've paid the property taxes and it is generally believed that that is sufficient to make a claim on for adverse possession. Also, I think maybe we should point out to Stacey that in relation to property taxes, when title is being transferred in a normal transaction, so where we have registered taxes and we have an arm's length seller and purchaser, the property taxes have to be up to date and paid. Otherwise, the stamp commissioner will not process for stamping the agreement for sale. So persons need to be aware that the property taxes must be paid and must be up to date.
Right, that's correct. And another point to mention, property taxes can be paid quarterly. So if you're unable to pay the property taxes for the full year or annually, you can make the payments every 3 months.
Okay, great. Good point. We have one other question, Stacey, and this comes from a viewer who wanted to know, he explained that he owned land jointly with a relative, and the intention was to develop this land, whether it was by putting up a townhomes, putting up a single family home. But his cousin is unable to finance that undertaking. His cousin doesn't have the funds necessary to follow through on what was initially planned. But notwithstanding, his cousin is prepared to sell him their half share in the land. He wants to know what steps would need to be taken to transfer this half share and how long would this process take?
Okay, so in light of these circumstances, purchasing the cousin's half share would be the best option. So what we would do, we would draft a sale agreement for the half share of that property. The transfer tax payable on that transaction, rather than the 2%, the standard 2% on the value of the whole property, transfer tax would be paid on the half interest. So if the property is, say, valued at $10 million, if you're transferring a half interest, your transfer tax would be payable on $5 million. After the agreement is drafted, we send it to the stamp office for assessment of payment of transfer tax and stamp duties. This typically takes between 2 to 3 weeks. Once the notice is issued, the vendor would pay the transfer tax and stamp duty, and we have the transfer drafted and cross-stamped. This takes approximately, I would say, 5 business days.
Can you explain cross-stamping for our listeners?
Sure. All right. So what it is, the transfer form that we submit to the titles office to enable the registration to be endorsed on title, it's stamped, the stamp office stamps it to show that you've actually made the payment of the transfer tax and stamp duty on the sale.
So the sale agreement is first sent to the stamp office, who makes a determination as to whether the value that has been stated is reasonable and within market.
Right.
if it is, and generally we have no issues there, 2% of that value is assessed for stamp duty. That duty is actually, that calculation of that duty is actually impressed with a stamp on the agreement for sale, hence the term stamping. In the past, there would actually be postage stamps. Mm-hmm. And so that stamping or impression of the value is done by the stamp office. What I take...
And in that, sorry to call you, in that stamp, the actual impression, it shows the amount, the dollar value that has been paid in relation to transfer tax
and stamp duty, which we haven't really mentioned because it's now a nominal sum. It
right.
used to be 4%, it's now 5,000 Jamaican dollars. And then once the transfer form, which is the form that the Registrar of Titles uses together with the agreement for sale to transfer that half interest, is prepared, it's also sent back to the stamp office, which confirms the stamping of the agreement for sale, and then stamps the same value
right.
on the transfer form. So hence we call it cross-stamping.
Right.
The stamp office is really verifying and confirming that taxes have been paying on the prior document and simply are repeating that stamping without any additional sums being paid. So you can take it from there. What happens next?
All right, so once we have the cross-stamp transfer, that along with the transfer tax certificate. So the transfer tax certificate is a certificate that the stamp office issues as evidence of the payment of transfer tax and stamp duty. So along with the stamp that they'll impress on the document, they also issue a transfer tax certificate. So that will be sent along with the transfer form, the duplicate certificate of title, and the registration fees for the registration to the titles office. The registration fees for the transfer is 0.5% of the value of the sale price. Titles office typically takes 5 to 10 business days to endorse the transfer on title, and then it's returned to us.
So both processes, what I understand, there are two aspects to the transaction. Once the agreement is drafted and signed, it's sent for stamping. That stamping process takes 2 to 3 weeks, and then you complete transfers. The transfer is lodged together with the transfer tax certificate with the duplicate certificate of title at the Registrar of Titles, or what we call the Titles Office. And that process, you see, could take about 2 weeks.
Right.
And so together, we're looking at 4 to 5 weeks to complete the entire process.
That's correct. And the Titles Office, they also offer an express and expedition service. So if it is that you want to pay the additional fee for expedition, the turnaround time for that is 48 hours.
And what's that fee?
The fee is $10,000. Okay,
great. So it's good to know, and our viewers, I think, would be happy to know that not in all cases, things can move fairly swiftly. And getting a title out of the titles office in 48 hours is, certainly something to be applauded, and it's a service we use quite frequently. Well, Stacey, I think that rounds out the questions we have for today. Always good to have you. Happy to speak and share with our viewers on many of these issues which affect transactions that they do and carry out on an ongoing basis. So thanks again. Bye from us both, Robert Taylor, Stacey Salmon, Taylor Law, and Home and Away Jamaica.